definitely pre-COVID. So some time ago, given our overlapping interests in questions relating to Islam and Muslim communities in Europe, he has an exciting new book out, and I'm very grateful that he has offered to give us a talk today that will cover the core findings of the book, but I think also very interestingly talk about how a book that is primarily historical in orientation actually tells us something about things that are going on today, and how certain historical patterns relating to the governance of Muslims during colonial period in Europe helps us to understand dynamics that are present. So the title of the talk is The Colonial Legacy of Europe's Islam Policies, the Cases of Austria and Germany, and the book itself is entitled Governing Islam in Austria and Germany from Colonial Times to the Present. Just to give you a brief background and introduction to our speaker, Dr. Hafez is Assistant Teaching Professor of International Relations at the College of William and Mary, earned his PhD in Political Science from the University of Vienna. From 2014 to 21 was a postdoc at the University of Salzburg's Political Science and Sociology departments. And then moved over to the United States in 2021, where he taught for several years at Williams College in Massachusetts. He'd also spent time in California earlier as a Fulbrighter at the University of California Center for Race and Gender. I mentioned the Georgetown affiliation already, which continues from 2017, where he's been a non-resident senior researcher at the Bridge Initiative at Georgetown, a flagship project at Georgetown focused on understanding and addressing the phenomenon of Islamophobia. Dr. Hafez has published more than 150 publications. He was the founding editor of the German English Islamophobia Studies Yearbook and co-editor of the European Islamophobia Report. 2015, he received the Bruno Heisty Award for the Political Book of the Year for his anthology Islamophobia in Austria, and his latest publications include The Rise of Global Islamophobia in the War on Terror, Coloniality, Race, and Islam, and Politicizing Islam in Austria, the far-right impact in the 21st century. Main areas of study include politics and religion, far-right parties and movements, and anti-Muslim racism. Dr. Hafez, welcome to the Abu Suleiman Center, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor for me to be here today, especially because this is the inaugural presentation of the book. So that's really the very first one. So thank you for to the center and everybody who's here and your interest. So let me just get started. What I want to talk about today is basically the following. I'm going to give you sort of like an overview of what the book is all about and what I intend to do in terms of the contribution to the field of research here. I'm going to speak a little bit about my theoretical approach and what I feel is the most important aspect of what I bring up here and add to the discussion, and then a couple of empirical examples just to be able to grasp what I mean in real terms. And then I hope that we can move on to an interesting Q&A session. All right, so I would like to start with, being trained primarily as a political scientist. I'm interested and have been interested for a long time in understanding how European governments are regulating, accommodating, managing Muslim folks in Europe. And the book that that you see here on the slides is maybe one of the most quoted works ever when it comes to what they call the accommodation of Islam in Western Europe. It's a book by two political scientists, Fetzer and Soper, Muslims in the State in Britain, France, and Germany. And their main argument in that book, which I'm very sympathetic with, is that it's historical institutionalism that kind of explains how Muslims are being governed. So their argument is there is a path dependency in the way of how Western states are relating to existing churches and other religious denominations, And this kind of informs the way of how they deal with their Muslim subjects. All right. Now, there is obviously also a counter argument to that. There is a lot of scholarship that would argue, hey, that's not really true, because what we see is there is a lot of discrimination going on with Muslims, right? We see whole discourses on radicalization, prevention, extremism, counter-extremism programs, and all of these discourses inform actually how states have a very different way of how they are relating to their Muslims when compared to other religious communities, denominations, and churches. Now, I'm very sympathetic to the historical argument, but I think there is more to be said about both of these two angles, because what Fetzer and Soper basically did not do is include the question of how the way of managing Muslims departs from the way of managing Christianity. And what a lot of the other scholarship that is more critical, that looks at Islam post 9/11 or maybe post 1945 does not do is look at a longer history. So that's kind of like where I come in. And there is one work that I really want to mention here that kind of gave a little bit of the direction of where I'm going, a work by which is an anthology. It's a lot of different articles on different areas, regional areas. A work by Bader, Mawson, and Morse, which is a collection of studies that identified what they see as the continuities and ruptures within the colonial and post-colonial governance of Islam. But what this book does not do is necessarily look at how that comes back to the motherland. So their work focuses on the colonial governance of, let's say, the British in India and what the colonial legacies are then in India, all right, not in Britain. So this is what I'm interested in. When I look at the two cases here, Germany and Austria, I'm not interested in how this has a legacy in today's governance of Islam in Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, and Bosnia, respectively. But I'm interested in how what the colonial governance learned and experienced with during the times of high imperialism, how that returns back to Europe post-1945. How the bureaucracy and what they learned there is coming up again in the post-war European phase. That's my interest. The other thing is obviously, and this is, in a way of what my contribution is, I bring together a lot of different kinds of literatures. So on the one hand, obviously coming from a political science perspective, that is my dominant lens. And I'm interested in the administration. I'm interested in the bureaucracy. I'm interested in the policy making on the ground. There is obviously a lot of good post-colonial theory stuff going on in regards to Muslim affairs that discusses ideas, discusses questions of racialization, that draws back to that era. But it's not so much that they are then looking into how does that manifest in the governance itself of the state. And this is what I'm interested in. Then there is obviously a great and numerous works of historians who have studied Islam during imperialism, during the interwar period, during the Nazi regime. And basically what I do is I make a bigger argument in connecting all of those different literatures. So that's kind of like my contribution. And theoretically, and I'll speak about this a little bit more in a bit, theoretically what I do is basically bring in something into the discussion that is a lot of times very absent from the poli-sci literature, which is race, and drawing basically on questions of, I'll just admit people here and do as if I were you, and try to and draw on the decolonial literature on the idea of the coloniality of power, from which I kind of relate to Islampolitik, as it was called in the German, and come up with this notion of the coloniality of Islampolitik. All right. So I begin the discussion of my book with 3 episodes, and I want to talk about those because I think it gives you a great glimpse and good intro into what I am at. So the first episode is basically coming from a man called Benjamin von Kallay. Benjamin von Kallay was the most important colonial governor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He basically had control over Bosnia from a long span of time from 1882 to 1903, more than 20 years. And he was, so to speak, kind of like the ultimate authority over what would happen in Bosnia on behalf of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this is from a quasi-memoir that he wrote in 1900, in which he says, and I want to read that, "Before our eyes, an interesting, and in terms of its extent, a significant part of the great world problem is taking place. And this große Weltproblem, as he called it, was whether and how it is possible to integrate the Mohammedan view of life into the framework of modern, loyal progress in such a way that the Mohammedan element also becomes an equal factor of the same." One of the interesting things with Benjamin von Kallay, who was of Hungarian descent, coming from an aristocratic background, and who was the joint minister of finance for both of the chambers, Hungary and Austria, and in charge of Bosnia. Initially, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, some recommended to have a colonial department for Bosnia, which was not followed suit, and then basically it was put into the hands of the finance minister. And one of the interesting things when you look into the resources is basically that you can see that race is everywhere. And that astonished me in so many ways, because as a student back in Vienna, I was reading the historians' works on Bosnia and what they would call in their literature the occupation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But race was completely absent. So that is one of the interesting differences if you look into the German literature of historians and the Anglo-Saxon literature. There is great work on the Anglo-Saxon side that kind of puts forward these ideas, which are there, right? But which are almost like completely absent from the discussion in the German-speaking literature. Now, I'll just give you here like one example of how he conceived of the Bosnian identity. He would say it's basically an Oriental race, which he called the Turkic Mohammedan Weltanschauung. Because obviously, Bosnians being a wilayat of the Ottoman Empire before it was occupied by the Austro-Hungarian Empire for more than 400 years, it was basically nothing else but in the imagination of the Austro-Hungarians, part of this Oriental race. And I'll come to speak about some of the details later on. Fast forward 130 years later, we have Sebastian Kurz, Chancellor of the Austrian government, who introduced a new act. So that's obviously one of the huge differences of a lot of European countries, but especially Austria compared to the United States. You do have like a state regulation of religion, which means that there is legislation that kind of regulates in legal text form how and what the privileges and what the position of a specific denomination or church is, right? So you had the Islam Act of 1912 that was born out of this whole politics of the occupation of Bosnia. And then in 2015, a new Islam Act was implemented, which was widely seen as highly discriminatory and kind of like institutionalizing the difference between Muslims and all other religious communities. There are about 16 that are legally recognized religious communities. And the reason for why he did that, the reason for the way of how he legitimized that in the public was because he said, I want, and I've put this into quotes here, I want an Islam of Austrian imprint. Islam österreichische Prägung, which for him was a means to counteract what he called political Islam, which is like this idea of the transnational threat to Austrian sovereignty. All right, so that's episode 1. Then I use episode 2. Episode 2 is here a guy who should be very well known to Islamic studies folks, Karl-Heinrich Becker. Karl-Heinrich Becker was a professor at the institute, the Colonial Institute of Hamburg, which today is the University of Hamburg, and was also the editor, founding editor of a magazine that is still around these days, Der Islam, is one of the most important flagship journals in Islamic studies. And he was not only a scholar, but he was very much involved in the colonial politics. He did expeditions to Tanzania, Cameroon, Togo. He was also involved in advising the government. He was part of all the colonial congresses. And last but not least, like other of his colleagues, he was training future bureaucrats in Hamburg to go to the overseas territories and govern the Muslim subjects over there. So another example would be Martin Hartmann, for instance, who was the editor of another flagship Islamic studies journal, Die Welt des Islams, which still is all around, right? And his institute that was established in 1912, that established this journal in 1912, trained an overall number of 101 colonial officials, 65 postal officers, and 228 colonial military officers for those regions where they governed the Muslim folks. So anyways, going to his a contribution of his during one of the 3 German colonial congresses that happened in Berlin, and that basically brought together all the different actors that were involved in the colonization. So the governors from overseas, some of the district officers, but also the different colonial departments which were part of the German Kaiserreich. And during that Congress, he said, the Islam question, and everybody who is aware of the discussions back then might be reminded of the Judenfrage, the Jewish question, right? Here, the Islamfrage is a colonial political problem of utmost importance. The existence of the Islamfrage presumes the existence of a conscious Islampolitik on behalf of the administration. The government is aware of this big and difficult duty. Now, clearly what is interesting here is, and this is where I get this whole idea of the Islampolitik. It's not an invention by myself. Islampolitik is basically the notion that was used back then by those colonial officials, by those who were intertwined into the knowledge production to make the German Kaiserreich a successful project in Cameroon, Togo, and Tanzania. And it's also a terminology that is currently used primarily, I would say, in legal and political science scholarship. So it's by no means a notion that I kind of invented, but rather very much coming out of the empirical reality that I analyzed. The next episode is, again, jumping almost 100 years fast forward in 2006, where the German Minister of Interior, Wolfgang Schäuble from the Christian Democratic Union, said during the most important institution that was invented by the German federal government in order to structure or restructure the relationship between the state and its Muslims, the German Islam Conference. This German Islam Conference was basically invented in order to create what he said, amongst others, the German Imam. Now, the German Imam is not a new invention. If you go back into the colonial era, you'll see that they wanted to have the Deutsch-Kaiserliche Imam, or Mualimo, as it was called in Swahili. So it was the German the German Kaiserreich's imam that they had 100 years earlier. And similarly, the Scientific Council, which is a body that advises the federal government in terms of all things pertaining to academia, in a landmark report in 2009, suggested to recruit, as it's said here, from a pool of homegrown young academics, because such does not exist. Clearly, you had a lot of imams, you had a lot of Muslim clergy folks around, you had people who were running mosques for decades. But the idea was to invent something new, something that is in support of the German Constitution, something that is seen as countering radicalization. So it is again about the governance of the Muslim folks in the image of the German state. All right, so these two episodes, and then there is one episode, and I'll go a little bit back in time here, which kind of combined and was a fusion of the Austrians and the Germans, which is the Nazi era. Adolf Hitler himself was speaking about what he called the positive Musulmanenpolitik, or positive Muslim policy. I don't know if that is the best translation, but that's the best I found. So initially, the Nazi regime was not that much interested in Islam-related policies. But very much to the end of the war, when they saw that they were almost defeated in 1942, they started to establishing a couple of different institutions. And there were different institutions within the Nazi regime. The Foreign Office on the one hand, the SS, which is the police, on the other hand, that established a couple of different bodies that would be investing in the creation of new educational institutions to, on the one hand, train the people in the army, because the ultimate aim was to fight against the Russians, the French, and the British in the Balkans, in the Caucasus, and in the Middle East, because what they feared is, as they saw it, that they had their Muslim armies to basically counteract that, all right? And that was, in a way, what we could see, even in terms of the personnel that was engaged in those efforts. There was a lineage going back to the Kaiserreich. So a lot of the reports that were done during, let's say, the World War I as part of the German Kaiserreich, we could see the same people coming up again, or their pupils, their students, who were trained by those Orientalists in order to suggest how the idea of the militancy of Islam could be used for the sake of the Nazi regime for its war efforts. All right, so that's kind of like how I start the story. And the argument that I make is that, first of all, if we do social science research on this question of the governance of Muslims, we have to expand our social science scholarship going way beyond the contemporary. I think historical knowledge is key to understand what is going on today. And that's one of the things that I think in social sciences in general lacks a lot. Maybe the American political science is a little bit different, because there are indeed, especially in international relations where I work, there is a lot of scholarship that actually draws on history, right? But it's not so much the case for social science in a narrow sense. And my societal contribution in that sense is also to address what the German historian Jürgen Zimmermann called the colonial amnesia, or the Austrian historian Walter Sauer called the national lie, which is, if you go to Austria today and ask any people on the street, well, what do you think about like the colonial past of Austria? They'll say, Austria never had colonies, right? So to that extent, it is part of the collective consciousness that colonialism is actually a non-issue. And in a way that also addresses what Fatima Al-Taib called, and she speaks in this regard about larger parts of Europe, the racism amnesia. And I think with that book, that contribution is to basically address all of these moments of silences of how to imagine in the wake of the end of the Holocaust, the end of World War II, this post-racial Europe that kind of erases the idea of race itself, which then does not enable any discussion about race, which in a way explains why we are where we are, even in the scholarship of this question. All right, so here is basically the areas that I'm talking about. So Austro-Hungary, the largest continental empire at that time. And in the case of Germany, its colonies in what is today parts of Tanzania, parts of Cameroon, and parts of Togo. So southwest colonies, Southwest African colonies of Germany, today's Namibia, is excluded from the discussion because there were basically no Muslims there. So what I was interested in, obviously, being how they governed Muslims is excluded this territory. So in a way, what I also do is in line of what other scholars had said previously, like Hannah Arendt or Aimé Césaire, or contemporary folks like Paul Gilroy, is I ask how the treatment of colonized peoples basically returns to Europe. All right, so that's like the underlying assumption that I have here. And what I end up doing is demonstrating the enduring legacy of colonial racialized policies towards Muslims and its relevance for Islampolitik in contemporary Austria and Germany. So obviously in Germany, you had, following the unification of Germany in 1871, a mere 10 years later, in 1881, Germany started to colonize the world, and it became in a very short period of time the fourth largest colonial empire. Whereas in the case of Austria, we do have basically Bosnia and Herzegovina that was an expansion of the already existing Austro-Hungarian continental empire. All right, so what's my theoretical approach? I speak of the coloniality of Islampolitik. What do I mean with that? When I speak of the coloniality of Islampolitik as an integral aspect of the modes of regulation of racialized bodies by white Europeans who have imagined Europe as the homeland of sort of a Christian or a Christian secularized space, I basically draw on this idea of Michel Foucault in his concept of the dispositive, where he says the dispositive is kind of the sum of policy approaches to govern, administer, control, and regulate Islam, in my case, and its adherents, right? So both Christianity and what some people called white secularity, a concept that basically refers to the pattern in which certain forms of religion, which is white Christian religions, are in a way privileged and are seen as part of the contract of the new secular regime. This is kind of where I position this work. And racialization, obviously, in my understanding here, does not only refer to biological inferiority, as it was done in the times of high imperialism, but also to this broader understanding of racialization. I could draw on Frantz Fanon and many others who said in the 60s, quoting Fanon, racism has not managed to harden. It has had to renew itself, adapt itself, change its appearance. So in a way, I conceptualize religion here as a quasi-race of differentiation in the process of the governance of European empires and contemporary states. All right. So clearly, one of the other things that I relate my work with is this whole literature on anti-Muslim racism. And I especially draw on this idea that was put forward by scholar Rana Junaid, who spoke of the Muslim racial becoming, which is kind of this idea that racialization is always in the making. It never stands still. It's very flexible. And I think what this helps us to is also to understand that Islampolitik is a form of racialized policies that never stands still. It is always changing. And I show that in the book with a lot of different examples. And let me just speak, for instance, about the question of militancy. I gave this example of the Nazi regime and how they basically used this idea of maleness and violence and militancy being part and parcel of Muslim identity as a positive marker. That was not an invention by the Nazi regime. You had that in World War I when the German Empire, when the Kaiserreich was fighting alongside the Ottoman Empire, basically going to the Sheikhul Islam and asking him, can you do a fatwa for us to say, hey, all Muslims in the world have to fight the French and the British? And they did it, right? So there was already this idea of militancy that was part of the understanding that was invented in those days of high imperialism. But if you go to the very early beginnings of a German colonization of these territories, you will encounter a different notion of militancy. Militancy was a threat, right? The militant resistance that the Germans met once they started occupying those territories was a racialized form of militancy that was to be cracked down on. So you can see these ideas changing over the course of times in different contexts, and the functionality of it was basically how to best mobilize and accommodate it for the state's sake. And that's kind of the argument that I make with racialized coloniality of Islampolitik, that on the one hand essentializes the idea of Muslimness, but also it has a flexibility that allows for those images to change according to the context in which the state power finds itself, and what alliances they need and what kind of threats they want to manage. All right. So it enables a better understanding of its flexibility and functionality. And one way of how somebody put that is, I'm drawing again on Karl Heinrich Becker, the famous Orientalist and founder of Der Islam journal, who said in one of the colonial congresses, the diversity of religion is the very natural expression of the natural diversity of the races. So you can clearly see the idea of how, to what extent the idea of religion is being racialized, which in a way I don't make this point here in the book, but I think it's also interesting in regards to the overall origin of the idea of race as something that appeared in the 14th century in the Spanish context, where basically race was initially in the Spanish vernacular and a synonym of blood and religion, right? And in a way, it's almost like a reminder of these early beginnings of the idea of race. Okay, so when I speak about the coloniality of power, then I draw on this decolonial literature, where the coloniality of power is seen as an important moment for the codification of the difference between conquerors and conquered in the idea of race, a supposedly different biological structure that placed some in a natural situation of inferiority. Now, one way for me to explain and to argue for how powerful that concept is to bring, in fact, together two highly different cases. Because if you look at those two cases of the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, as well as contemporary Germany and Austria, you'll see that they are different in many, many, many ways. First of all, you have in the case of Austria a proxy European continental colony. In Germany, you have overseas. In Africa, the main center of colonial rule is very close. You have the colonial capital of Vienna. To send a letter took 1 to 2 days, whereas in the German case, it took 1 to 2 months, right? So the ability of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to micro manage the Bosnian colony was very strong. They had a strong hold on them. Whereas in the German case, the real power of everyday colonial governance was in fact with the district officers and the governors in those colonies. Then again, for the Austrian case, you have white colonized subjects. For the Germans, black and brown. The duration of the imperial rule is one of the few commonalities. We speak of about 40 years. But then again, if you think about, well, I mean, first of all, we don't think about Austria generally in terms of colonialism, right? There's always this idea, and that's the image that they have pertained until now, is it was actually a very benevolent, multilingual, multi-religious, tolerant empire. So it's usually characterized as a form of soft colonialism, whereas the Germans are known for their brutality, like the French folks, right? They were the only colony that banned interracial marriage, for instance, right? And they were very brutal in the way they fought against the newly colonized population. Then when we speak about the post-colonial subjects, in the case of Austria, after the war in Yugoslavia in 1992, since then we have a large amount of Muslim population, speaking about 25%, if we include also the Albanians, who are of these formerly colonized places, whereas in the case of Germany, there's hardly any. Majority is Turkish, like in Austria, and other places, Arab countries, etc., Syria now. And then when it comes to the legal framework, the difference could not be stronger, right? So we have a legal recognition of Islam. They always pride themselves of that since 1912, whereas in Germany, there is hardly any. There is one state, Hesse, which has legally recognized the Ahmadiyya Muslim Jamaat, and that's it, right? But all the other states of Germany, you have largely any kind of lacking legal recognition. Now, given, and that's usually a poli-sci thing that people do, we show two very different examples, and then we argue, okay, that indeed gives emphasis to why this explanation is so strong. So that's kind of the case that I want to do. So what I end up doing is I analyze two fields, two policy fields. One is religious bureaucracy. What I mean by that is how the state recreates new religious institutions, how it creates religious authority, how it shapes what religion is a legitimate religion and what is illegitimate. And not identical with that, but still highly important also for the sake of the first one, is how to create religious educational institutions that teach that kind of understanding of Islam that the German or Austrian state or the empires or the Nazi regime can use for the stability of their regimes. All right? So that's kind of what guides my analysis, the analysis of these two policy fields. And what I attempt to demonstrate that although the era of formal imperialism is long over, the post-war states of Austria and Germany have continued to rely on such institutions to basically discipline their Muslim populations. And let me give you an example here and this is kind of like my last slide, and I'll speak about a couple of empirical examples of what some of the findings are. So the image here shows two pictures. One is some Muslims of the Hunjar troops who were fighting for the Nazi regime, studying a book on Islam and the Jewish religion, and then an askari, which was a widely shared idea of this African Muslim black soldier that was serving in what the Germans called back then the Schutztruppe. Schutztruppe is literally speaking kind of the troop that protects, which is in a way a euphemism for the colonial troop. So that was basically the military with which the German Empire, once it started colonizing those areas, tried to go specifically into the hinterlands. And it was like the cheap cannon fodder that they used in order to gain more territory. Many of them were actually of Sudanese origin and deployed in those areas that were newly conquered. So what are the patterns that I see? I speak here of resistance, control, and accommodation. As a first step, the colonial regimes of the German Empire, the dual monarchy, the Nazi regime, and even the post-colonial states of Austria and Germany they have all cracked down on any kind of Muslim opposition, right? I mean, clearly at the beginning it was resistance, armed resistance, because even if the Ottoman Empire said, okay, let's make a deal with the Austro-Hungarians, let them have Bosnia, we still gonna hold on to our, legally speaking, to our sovereignty. And they are in legal terms still under our control. But let them do the real work on the ground. The Bosnians were not easygoing with that solution. They fought back. They didn't care what the Sultan had to say. They fought back because they felt like we cannot live under a non-Muslim rule, right? That was quite a new thing for them after 400 years being a vilayet. So this resistance was obviously met with a large amount of people getting killed. Between 65 and 150,000, the numbers vary, that basically fled to the Ottoman Empire, that did not want to remain there, which for those numbers were very large for that time. So the insurgent Muslims, basically who had fought against them, they were either hanged, imprisoned, or expelled. And once that opposition was cracked down on, under the dual monarchy of Austro-Hungary, for instance, the Muslim opposition leaders were banned from the country, not allowed to re-enter again. Their infrastructure was cut off from the Ottoman Empire because that was one of the big questions. All the religious clergy, and it was a religiously organized kind of territory, was depending on the caliph, right? And on the Sheikh al-Islam, who would give the menshura, which is kind of the decree, the religious authorization that they could serve as muftis in those different places. And the Austrians came up with a new infrastructure, which was the racial ulema, which still exists until today, right? And this racial ulema, the master of the learned, literally, which was now a centralized new religious infrastructure that the dual monarchy came up with, that was the new way of how they were able to govern those religious subjects in their way. In the West African territories of the German Empire, German colonialists also either executed or deposed the Fulbe leaders, replaced them with loyal people from within their ranks. In German East Africa, following the initial invasion and violent suppression of, let's say, the so-called Arab revolt or the Abu Shiri revolt, you have had Arab notables who were recruited as collaborators. So basically what they did, they would set up a new infrastructure of loyalists who would succumb to the new regime and do whatever bidding they had to do. Once the Muslim opposition had been defeated, each of these regimes restructured the already existing bureaucracy, filled their institutions with loyalists. You had, for instance, in German East Africa, you had the necessity for a Quranic school to get the ijaza to be able to teach new kids about religion. That had to go through the channels of the German bureaucracy. So by that, they took over control of who can be one of the learned. And whenever you had new religious movements coming up and questioning or not questioning, just existing, basically like, for instance, a lot of the Qadiriya Sufi movements who did those public gatherings, which the Germans then called the Zikri, which was basically based on this idea of doing a dhikr in the public space, the remembrance of God. These were basically cracked down and forbidden, especially because a lot of women participated, and that was according to the colonial laws, women could not gather for political reasons first and foremost, and when they did so, and these religious gatherings were basically reformulated as a sort of a subversion of the colonial patriarchal regime, that was kind of a problem in itself that was then cracked down on. So all of these different regimes attempted to create new religious institutions. And once they did that successfully, it did not mean that the resistance went away. There were always ups and downs and moments of resistance coming from different pockets, like the Mahdi movement in Togo and Cameroon, at the beginning of the 20th century, for instance, or the Muslim movements for independency who tried to get autonomous Waqf systems and religious infrastructure. That was always in back and forth that created, obviously, in a very dialectical relationship, new infrastructure that, on the one hand, shows to what extent the Muslims tried to hold on to their own agency, but still very much reveals how at least the overall leadership was clearly in the hands of the new colonial governance. And it's super interesting to read all these letter exchanges between the colonial governors and the district officials when they were talking to each other and saying, basically, you know, get him on the paycheck of the government, then he will be silent, right? Somebody under our control is better than somebody under their control. So it's very clear, it's very obvious, nothing is hidden, because obviously, probably, they would never have thought that somebody would read that 100 years later, dealing with colonial subjects that were not aware of the German language, right? The Germans, for instance, they came up with a vocabulary of 150 words of a new German dictionary that every African person should learn in order to be able to serve the German Empire as a native official, right? So it was clearly this idea of the extent to which we train those people is to the extent of how they can be useful for us. And very few of the selected elites were those who then were, some of them were knighted, some of them became notables, who were kind of included in this symbolic regime of power. And one of the things that I also show is to what extent that still holds on, right? You see that in the way of, for instance, and I gave this example at the very beginning, Islamic theology as a state project. In Germany, after this advisory council had issued this report, you had 6, 7 different departments of Islamic theology being established in German public universities, who basically were filled with a lot of people who either would not question the state power or would very much serve it, right? You had then institutions of surveillance that were established, like the Austrian Documentation Center Political Islam, that was filled with those Muslim theology professors who were given those positions. And you can clearly see like how one hand feeds the other and how those structures of mass surveillance on the one hand that we had in the German colonial empire and we continue to have in post-colonial Germany and Austria, how that really, it becomes better, it becomes more efficient, but it's not really like that huge of a change as we would imagine. Like some people who do the research on, let's say, the post 9/11 securitization of Muslims, I think they would be flabbergasted to see how the colonial empire had already a list of different Muslim social movements who were being surveilled very tightly and who were tried not to go to Mecca, to find some comrades from other colonized territories to share what they saw as pan-Islamic ideas and so on and so forth, in order to not allow for any kind of resistance to grow out of those globalized Muslim religious friendships, cooperations, whatever. There is a lot of different details that I could give here, but I think basically, I think the idea, I hope I was able to convey that. What is really important and where I see also one of the interesting aspects that is oftentimes left out is to what extent all of these policies were basically legitimized by a racialization of the Muslim subjectivity. Now, if you look, for instance, the first moment the Germans went to Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, the idea was that the African peoples were actually not real Muslims. They called them half Muslims. They said the real problem is the Arab notables, right? Those who were leading the resistance. Once that resistance was gone, the Arab notables became a superior race in between the whites and blacks. And then the black folks became racialized as the kind of, less educated, less elevated kind of human being. Similarly, the Bosnians. The Bosnians originally were seen as a race in between the Europeans and the Orientals. At the moment when those leaders who would collaborate with the regime were mobilized, then you had the idea of actually the Bosnians being not Oriental, but being part of the Bogomil European aristocracy. And therefore, we can actually argue that they are white. So there is this constant flexibility in the racialization of the other that allows the regime at one time to include and at the other moment to exclude them from who we are as the elite leadership of a country. All right, I'll end on that note. Thank you for the attention.